Can your VO2max actually be limited by your breathing? That's what we're going to talk about today. I've got some fun information to share with you in that regard. First of all, we're going to talk about the different limitations that affect VO2max and what we can do to train those limitations and increase our maximal oxygen uptake. And then we'll talk about the breathing aspect and how it does in certain cases limit VO2max, and actually the way in which we're going to be able to train that will be a little bit different. I'll explain all that in the video. So to begin with, there seems to be four main factors that can limit your VO2max, and to understand them or to find them, we just have to think about what is the pathway that oxygen follows inside the body. So we take it from those guys, right? They take carbon dioxide, they take sunlight, and they make oxygen and sugars. And then we use the oxygen inside our mitochondria. And guess what? We also use the electrons inside the sugars. Or we eat the things that eat the sugars. And that's how the world goes around. So we can't live without all of this, right? So the oxygen starts on the outside. Then it's going to travel inside through our respiratory tract. It's going to go into our lungs, and then it's going to go through the alveoli, and it's going to pass into the bloodstream. This oxygenated blood is going to then be pumped by the left ventricle of the heart into the systemic circulation, and it's going to go towards, if we're talking about a physical activity, it's going to go towards the muscles, primarily the muscles that are active in the activity. That oxygen is then going to be transferred from the hemoglobin, the transporter, into the muscle fiber. And then inside that muscle fiber, we're going to have myoglobin that's going to transport the oxygen all the way to its final destination, which is inside the mitochondria, more specifically at complex 4 of the electron transport system. This is where oxygen is utilized. This is where it's turned into water. This is where it's accepting the electron. Oxygen in this framework is the final electron acceptor, essentially. So you can imagine it pulling the electrons through that electron transport system and receiving it at the end. And this, again, is what makes our world go around. If the mitochondria couldn't use oxygen, we probably wouldn't be here today. If mitochondria hadn't fused with our cells, or with the ancestors of what our cells are today, we couldn't actually use oxygen. So this is the pathway of oxygen inside the body, and we've gone through the different systems, and from that pathway we can now understand the four main factors that limit VO2max. So the first one, and I'll go from most important to least important on the list, and then we'll talk about the breathing at the end. So most important one is the heart. It seems like a large part of VO2max is determined by how much blood can your heart pump. And typically it seems like 50 to 70% of your VO2max, or of the VO2max limitation, is on the heart, meaning if we can train more, if we can build a bigger heart, we're going to improve our VO2max. And having spoken to an expert on the topic a little while ago, the main thing that's going to help you grow a bigger heart is physical activity across time. There's not one zone, there's not one mode of training, there's not one sport, there's not one magic time frame, but essentially, can you be as active as possible from the time that you're a kid all the way into your adult years? This is what's going to give you the best chances to have a big, strong heart. So if you want to pump a lot of blood, and if you want a high VO2max, which is going to help your performance and your health, you just need to be active. You just need to be active. Move as much as you can. Be as active as you can. Cycling, running, weightlifting, team sports, individual sports. It doesn't matter. Just pick something and then do a lot of it. Do it consistently. Do it regularly. Find pleasure in it. This is what will help you the biggest heart possible and grow your VO2max the most. Then the second factor we can talk about is the peripheral limitation, meaning the oxygen uptake inside the muscle. And here we're going to be talking about not only the capillary density that we find around the muscle fibers, which is also trained via large volumes of training over time, but we are going to talk about the ability of the muscle fibers to extract oxygen from the blood and use it. And for that, it seems like high intensity activities, whether they're HIIT training or even sprint interval training or just sprint activities in general, very hard, very intense, but short in time. All those things help your muscle fibers use up more oxygen. And this is going to be primarily through the fast twitch fibers, type 2A, type 2X, and all the hybrid intermediate fibers that exist. And essentially those fast twitch fibers, they have less mitochondria than the slow twitch fibers. And so, but they compensate for that lack of mitochondria by using up more oxygen. And if you solicit them, if you train them, if you stimulate them, if you fatigue them, you will essentially grow their mitochondrial function, as we can call it, and help them use more oxygen per unit of time or per unit of mitochondria. And that seems to also have a marginal impact on your VO2 max. So large volumes of training to grow your heart, high intensity and very high intensity activities to increase your muscles' ability to extract oxygen, to use oxygen. Those are the two main things you can do to improve your VO2 max. If we think in a very narrow way about the 4 limitations of VO2 max, obviously many other types of training, zone 2, etc., if we could talk about zones, but here we're just talking about the limiting factors. Third parameter is going to be oxygen transport inside the blood. So how can we train that? Again, large volumes of training over time is going to increase blood volume, and that we know increases preload of the heart, increases your VO2 max as well. And obviously, if you want to raise it even more, then you go and you start looking into altitude training, and now we can start raising hemoglobin mass, hemoglobin being the transport molecule for oxygen inside the blood. And so if we can increase that via training, then we can increase our VO2 max through those means as well. And now we get to the fourth and final limiting factor of VO2 max that has been documented in the scientific literature, and that is the respiratory system, which is interesting because typically we hear that breathing is not, or ventilation is typically not a limiting factor to VO2 max, which is true because in most cases at sea level, that's not going to be a limiting factor. But in some edge cases, it does limit your VO2 max. So the edge cases are if you go to altitude, less oxygen available, and then your body has to work harder to get that oxygen in. If there's less available outside, it's going to be harder to drive it in. That's going to limit your VO2 max. If you have any pulmonary disease of any kind or dysfunction, that is going to affect oxygen extraction from the environment into the body, and that can limit your VO2 max. And also, for a very small portion of the elite population, there is what is called hypoxemia, arterial hypoxemia is what it's called. Arterial because it's in the arteries, in the circulation. Hypoxemia because it's not hypoxia. Hypoxia is about the environment around us. Hypoxemia is a drop in oxygen saturation inside the blood. And we see this with individuals that have very high cardiac outputs. I think they go upwards of 40 liters per minute for the best or the most trained endurance athletes. 40 liters of blood pumped per minute by the heart, which is absolutely crazy. And you have to think that the red blood cells have to go single file inside the capillaries, inside the pulmonary capillaries, in order to have oxygen loaded up onto them, right? Which is crazy to think about, single file. And because the blood is moving so fast, they have to push that 40 liters per minute, and they're in single file, and so they end up going so much faster or so fast through those pulmonary capillaries that they don't even have time to load up the oxygen onto them. And this is where you start to see desaturation on the arterial side, and we'll typically see a limitation in VO2 max once it drops below, I think it's 95% saturation. So essentially, typically our blood is saturated around 99-98%. But it seems like for high-level endurance athlete with a huge cardiac output, they can be limited by their ability to load oxygen onto their hemoglobin, into their red blood cells at very high cardiac outputs. and that can affect them once oxygen saturation drops below 95% inside the blood. So that is technically a limitation that exists, but again, it's a marginal one. It doesn't apply to everybody. But then there's another aspect when we think about breathing and VO2 max. There's another aspect that is really interesting and that is starting to gain in popularity, but I think it still has some big years ahead of it. And I'm actually recording a video about this with my colleague Cyril, who's honestly one of the best in the field at this point in time in the world about respiratory training. The idea is that when you're doing any kind of high intensity activity, hence the VO2 max link, your respiratory apparatus, your respiratory muscles, intercostals, diaphragm, etc., consume upwards of 20% of your VO2 max. Upwards of 20% of your VO2 max for highly trained endurance athletes. It's closer to 10 to 15% for less trained populations. Up to 20% or upwards of 20% of your total VO2, of your total oxygen consumption, is dedicated to fueling your respiratory muscles, which is crazy, right? And so we can train those muscles just like we can train any other muscle to make them stronger, make them more endurant, increase their range of motion. And Cyril just published a paper. It's in French, but I want to do a video about this and another one. I'll go through what I said with him on the French video. Cyril published a paper. He had, I think it's a cohort of 10 high-level endurance athletes. We're talking 90 plus VO2 numbers for the group. Cyclists, triathletes, they did endurance and strength training of the respiratory muscles for, I think it's 10 months in his study, but he's got, I think, upwards of 15 months of data now. And the improvements in lung capacity, the improvements in strength of the diaphragm, the improvement in ventilation, in exercise, in situation, on the bike, in training, first threshold, second threshold, VO2 max is actually staggering. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about this and have that premise of VO2 max, because often we think, yeah, but ventilation doesn't limit VO2 max. And as you saw before, typically it doesn't, but it doesn't mean that you can't improve your respiratory muscles and essentially leave more oxygen and more blood available for your active muscles, because the respiratory muscles have priority over your legs or any other active muscle in any physical activity, because your brain decides so. Your brain says the diaphragm is more important than my legs, because if I tire, if I slow down, well, I'll slow down, but if I can't breathe, I die. So I have to breathe. So there's actually something called the respiratory metaboreflex. It's a metabolic reflex of the respiratory muscles, and which simply put means that when your diaphragm fatigues, your brain is gonna steal oxygen and blood from your legs or wherever it's going to essentially save your respiratory muscles. And you can actually attenuate this, diminish that effect by training your respiratory muscles, making them stronger, making them more endurant. So here's a little intro to that concept if you haven't heard of it before. Like I said, I'm going to have a chat with my colleague who just published this paper. Very, very interesting. One of a kind in terms of what has been done so far on the time frame of the study. And I look forward to sharing some of the findings with you. Make sure you share any questions you might have about this in the comments below so that I can use those to frame my English video on the topic. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.